Hi everyone, it's Thursday, May 7th, 2020. I hope everyone's doing well. Try to put out one or two videos a week just to sort of supplement what you guys should be reading, the PowerPoints, the videos, and the other materials that you're working on. I just want to say that most of you are doing what you're supposed to be doing. You guys are getting your work in on time. It's awesome. Some of you I've had to reach out to, make some phone calls home, which I'm going to continue to do. So please make sure that you're making up any missed work, and just do me a favor, and if you do make up a late assignment, again, the protocol all year is make sure that you are shooting me an email, giving me the name of the assignment and the date in which you completed it so I can verify it and then put it in my records. The latest news is obviously no final exams, no Regents exams. I'm going to continue finishing the curriculum. So be prepared for that. I am going to continue putting out information. Some of it's going to be graded, some of it's not. So again, that's your responsibility to keep up with Google Classroom, school notes, these postings. Come on the office hours if you have any questions or concern or you need an explanation about something per se. All these resources are here for you. Again, I hope everyone's doing well. I hope you guys are being safe and your family is safe, and we'll get through this. All right, so just want to take a short little mini lesson or discussion on the stages of the Vietnam War. I'm going to preface this by saying that I hope this is recording and we don't have what happened last week where I had to scrap a half-hour discussion and redo it. So I'm just hoping that this is going to work out. But you never know with technology. So again, I'm going to make this brief. This all complements chapter 29 in the textbook. So if I'm going too fast or if there's something that you want more of an explanation on, you could always go to the textbook. You could also go to the materials I put on Google Classroom, and that'll help you as well. Okay, so again, I'm not going to go through the minutiae detail of the Vietnam conflict because again, there's college courses on that. But you have to recognize that there were stages of the war and the conflict, depending on your perspective. Very much like the other conflicts and wars that we've studied in class. You know, if you remember, we talked about the Revolution and the French and Indian War and the War of 1812 and the Civil War and World War I. Okay, so all these conflicts had contextually what was going on in the United States, the policies behind it, the action, the actual stages, turning points, and then impact. So this list of 10 items sort of highlights the big events and, sort of what you need to know about the Vietnam War. But obviously, there's a lot more to the Vietnam War. There's thousands of books written about this conflict, dozens of movies. A couple movies that come to mind. Number one is Platoon. It came out in the late 1980s. I know you guys, that's really old for you. None of you were born then, but it was very good. It was Charlie Sheen and William Dafoe. Hamburger Hill was another movie about the Vietnam War. I want to say Full Metal Jacket too, as well. The Deer Hunter. Early Robert De Niro movie. So if you're into sort of pairing movies or film with historical events like I am, those are maybe some movies you might want to check out, and some of them you've probably already seen. But each one of them encapsulates basically a stage of this war. Also, Born on the 4th of July. With Tom Cruise was a really good movie about a soldier who comes home after the war and sort of the context of what the home front was and what a lot of soldiers had to deal with and the political climate of the time. So it really sort of gives you sort of the social, economic, and political sort of arena that was going on in the United States at the time. So let's look at the Vietnam War. Obviously, the dates back to the colonization in Southeast Asia of the French in Indochina, and obviously China and Japan played a role in that as well. The rise of nationalism, we talked about nationalism all over the world, specifically, Chiang Kai-shek in China, nationalist leaders everywhere, so make that connection too. So think about the middle of the 20th century was a time of nationalism and this rise of independent sovereign nations tearing away from their colonial masters, so to speak. Okay, so just again, you got to put every conflict and war in context. I always talk about context. Okay, so timing is everything, right? The same thing goes with war and conflict, right? So you have this nationalist movement in the United States. You have these policies of, we talked about this foreign policy the United States had of containment with the spread of communism. You had alignment between North and South Korea, North and South Vietnam, the Cold War. Okay, so this is one of those hot wars of the Cold War that we talked about last week. All right, and obviously this conflict spanned several presidencies, starting with Johnson, as far as the United States was concerned, and then going all the way up to Nixon and Ford, all the way up to like 1975. So this was a long, drawn-out conflict. Again, varying viewpoints, varying perspectives. So again, we're just going to talk about some of the key highlights. Gulf of Tonkin Resolution 1964 is an incident that occurred in the Gulf of Tonkin, which sort of justified American involvement in that region. Sound familiar? Okay, you can make these parallels to what you know of other conflicts. Okay, every conflict and every war usually has some sort of spark or some sort of event that justifies action. Okay, especially with American history, there's always that one key event where historians look back and say, that's when it all started going down, right? Like Lexington Concord, you could say the American Revolution, or Boston Tea Party, or you could say the Civil War, you could say Fort Sumter, right? World War I, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. But again, we know, because you've been sitting in Mr. Villani's class all year, and also because you are astute historians yourselves, that conflicts are usually brewing for a long time before there's any actual physical violence. Okay? Again, those events are just easy ways for us, meaning, people looking at an event from the outside in, to sort of categorize and organize these conflicts, okay? And so now you see a progression or a buildup of operations in Vietnam by the United States and the Allies, right? Very much like you saw in Operation Desert Storm in the early 90s, very much like you saw in Iraq and Afghanistan in the late 1990s and early 2000s, okay? Rolling Thunder, 1965, Americanized the war, more troops. So you have troops being deployed. So you see this buildup in North Vietnam, and then you see the usage, unbeknownst to many of the American public at times, of weapons such as napalm and Agent Orange, which had obviously lasting effects not only on the ecosystems of those areas, their psyche, but also on the citizens of those countries, and also the soldiers involved. Okay, and that all came out later on. Classified information that was made public that sort of flamed the fire of sort of this revolutionary movement that was burning during the 1960s, okay? You guys know that was like the hippie generation. There was a lot of counterculture going on, And the Vietnam War was sort of like the spotlight event that sort of was going on in the background that sort of fanned those flames, so to speak, okay? So you have this tiger versus elephant mentality, guerrilla warfare, okay? Again, the Vietnam War was a different war than it was fought earlier. It wasn't World War I, it wasn't World War II, where you had open conflict. You have different terrain, different geography. Again, going back to geography. If you remember during the American Revolution, where the colonists were successful in the South because they knew the terrain against the regimented British, very similar to that in South Vietnam. The Viet Cong knew the terrain and was advantageous and took advantage of that against the American forces. They also used trench warfare in South Vietnam, very much like we talked about trench warfare in World War I, except these trenches were in jungles as opposed to in open fields, so to speak. So again, even the concept of trench warfare is different in the American in the Vietnam War. By 1966 and 67, you have over 500,000 American troops deployed in Vietnam, and that number continued to grow. The idea was that, the idea at the time, or the strategy at the time, we're always talking about strategies, is that manpower, the amount of manpower was going to sort of contain the spread of communism and eventually defeat the North Vietnamese forces. And again, as I mentioned earlier, logistically that sounds sound, but it's very hard to throw manpower at an ideology. Okay? You have the Tet Offensive in 1968, which was a massive offensive against the United States and South Vietnam. It was a coordinated attack. It really turned the tide of the war. And again, it was a blow to the American psyche, to the American soldier, to the American government, and to the American people. And remember, this is at a time where live, war is being broadcasted, live pictures of wars being broadcasted, across the nation on televisions in everyone's dining room and living rooms as you're eating dinner every night. So people who were, media, just like yellow journalism did during the Spanish-American War, media played a major role in influencing the American public and soldiers. And the Tet Offensive was, again, a major turning point in the conflict in Vietnam. Like I mentioned before, you have the counterculture going on in the United States in the late 1960s. You have the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968, which was very contentious and violent. You had the Civil Rights Movement going on at this time, which we'll get into next week, which was, again, causing more divisiveness in the United States. So a lot of people think that, talk about 2020 and the last couple of years in our country, how divisive it's been. And believe it or not, and I know I've mentioned this before, there have been other times in our history where this country was seriously divided. Right off the top of the head, when I think divided, you guys should think of the Civil War. Think of all the sectionalism that was going on prior to the breakout of the Civil War. So divisiveness and contentiousness and, politics and social protest is not a new concept in American history. It's the only difference is the context, when and what is going on at the time. Okay? So again, we'll get more into the Civil Rights Movement next week. You have the race riots going on all across the country, even in Newburgh. If you talk to some old school Newburgh residents, they'll tell you about the race riots in the 1960s, the 1970s, and 1980s. Okay, this is before the Rodney King race riots in LA. This is before the race riots that we're probably more attuned to. But this dates well back for several generations. You have this idea of hawks versus doves, or people who were sort of pro-war and then pro-peace. You saw those terms used during the War of 1812 with the war hawks, if you remember that. Again, very generalized way to divide people, okay? And again, this idea of divisiveness, you hear that term a lot used today, and that was accentuated during the Vietnam conflict. You had people at home who had soldiers sons and daughters and family members, and they were divided on whether they should actually be and question the American government motives in Vietnam. You see that today across the world as well. Okay, this policy of Vietnamization was another stage of the war. Later on in the war, sort of giving back Vietnam to the Vietnamese by President Nixon. Some people thought this was a sound strategy. Others thought it was a cop-out because the American military and the American government realized at this time that they were not gaining, and at this point it was just a war of attrition, and they realized that no amount of supplies and no amount of resources was going to, it wasn't working what they were doing, and there was a lot of discontent in the American public, and there was a cry from both sides of the aisle to sort of end this conflict. So that's where the whole term, peace with honor came from, and the term Vietnamization was a strategy used or to promote. Nixon promoted for the Vietnamese government to take control of their government, of their people, sort of rebuilding Vietnam. Very similar to what was going on in the early 2000s in Iraq. And again, logistically, that sounds great. Ideologically, that sounds great on paper, but logistically, we know that there's a lot of issues with that. Okay, countries don't just go from dictatorships they don't go from being colonized to dictatorships to communist democracy, overnight. This all takes time, and it's not so clear cut. And we see the remnants of this all around the world today. And we see that in places like Africa, where countries are still struggling to find their identity after being colonized for so many years. Then back in 1975, the year Mr. Bellani was born. I know you guys are going to say Mr. Bellani is not old, but I don't remember watching this on TV because I was just born when this happened. But you have the fall of Saigon. This was sort of the symbolic end of the Vietnam War, where the communists took control of the entire country. And you have pictures of the U.S. embassy being invaded in Saigon and trying to be evacuated, and very famous images of helicopters, being overloaded with people trying to escape the city and actually falling off aircraft carriers as people are clinging on to the bottom of the helicopter because they knew if they stayed, they would be captured and probably executed. And then obviously the fallout of the war, the finger pointing, the POWs, the MIAs, the what could we have done, the would have, could have, should have's. So there's a lot going on. But just, again, not asking you to memorize the minutia, but just understand the context of the time, understand what was going on, understand the policies, make the parallels, make the connections to other conflicts. All right, guys, I know I just gave you guys a lot of information. If you're allowed to, you have to get permission from your parents, obviously, and I know most of you guys have Netflix, but I would recommend, there's a documentary on Netflix called The Vietnam War. It's produced by Burns and Novick. They do a great job sort of going through these different stages. They go into different details. I'm just going to warn you that some of the images is graphic, and it's a very controversial topic. For a long time, the Vietnam War, depending on how it was introduced in schools, it was sort of like one of those, it stirred up a lot of emotions, stirred up a lot of controversy, even to this day. But it's something that, needs to be discussed. It needs to be looked back on an integral part of not only 20th century U.S. history, but just 20th century history period, and then needs to be dissected and examined. Okay? All right, guys, with that, make sure you're getting your work in. If you have any questions, email me, reach out to me. Other than that, stay well, stay safe, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care, guys. Have a good day. Enjoy the weather. It's nice out today. Bye.